The cold wind of the North Sea strikes the face, constricting breath painfully. On the horizon are the silhouettes of longships, their prows rising above the waves like the heads of monsters. But where are those very horns? Where are the terrifying helmets that paintings, films, and games have used to scare us for centuries? Why have archaeologists who have sifted through thousands of mounds and burials not found a single helmet with horns? And if they didn't exist, who and why made the whole world believe in this myth? Historians assert throughout all excavations, including the famous finds in Jermunbu and Gokstad, not a single horned battle helmet has been found. All discovered samples were smooth, made of iron, with a reinforced nasal guard. A helmet with horns found in Denmark belongs not to the Viking Age, but to the Bronze Age, 1,000 years before their appearance. But why then, in the minds of millions, have horns become the symbol of the North? The warrior's mask, concealing the face behind narrow eye slits, was called a spangenhelm, from the word spanga, meaning a metal strip. It was a durable but heavy helmet, weighing about 2 kilograms, which protected the head from sword and axe blows. A spangenhelm did not gleam in the sun. On the contrary, it was often covered with leather or wool so as not to blind one's own in battle. Imagine a formation of northern warriors, mail shirts clinking, axes rising, breath escaping as steam from their mouths. No theatrical horns, only steel, leather, and the hoarse breath of people marching to their deaths. A Viking did not decorate his helmet. He hid his face so that fear would be on the enemy's side, not his own. But the myth of the horns was not born out of thin air. When Europe rediscovered the Vikings in the 19th century, artists and theaters desperately sought a symbol of savagery and barbarism. It was then that the legend was born. German costumers added horns to helmets for Richard Wagner's operas. And from that moment, the false image became an inseparable part of mass consciousness. And yet, behind fiction always hides a shadow of truth. For once, long before the Vikings, horns truly held significance in the rituals of the North. Who wore them, and why? With this question begins a story in which the truth about Vikings turns out to be far more dramatic than any myth. Northern fog rolls over the stone hills. There, where archaeologists once found 2 strange bronze helmets with horns. They date back to approximately the 11th century BC, a time when no Vikings yet existed. These helmets from Vexo and Gelshaug bore no traces of battle damage. They were too thin to withstand a blow. Their horns ended in miniature bird figures. This was not a weapon but a ritual symbol. A symbol of an ancient cult where warriors did not yet fight for land but danced for the gods. Priests, whom modern historians call Bronze Age shamans, participated in these rituals. Their goal was not victory but a connection with the otherworldly. It was from here that the most ancient archetype was born, the horned man, a mediator between the world of the living and the dead. His image was preserved in rock carvings, where people with horns stand next to sun discs. This symbol signified power, fertility, and the authority of nature. And it was from here, millennia later, that 19th century artists, without understanding the context, borrowed the motif of horns, attributing it to the Vikings. The word berserk later became synonymous with insane fury, but in its original sense it means one who wears a bearskin. Berserkers fought without armor. Their skin was their armor. Contemporaries believe that these warriors fell into a battle frenzy, similar to a trance. And it is here, according to some researchers, that the connection between ancient rituals and the Viking warrior culture emerges. Not horns, but the inner beast. That is what they awakened before battle. Imagine the field after the battle at Kopervik. Silence, the smell of blood, bodies on the cold ground. On them, simple iron helmets, mail shirts, wooden shields. Not a single horn, only rough practicality and the experience of sailors who knew that every superfluous detail was a chance to perish. Horns could get caught on branches in the forest, break in a fight, or hinder wearing a hood or mail coif. In real combat, this would have been foolish and dangerous. The helmets found in Geirmundbu were constructed from 4 iron plates joined by overlapping strips. At the bottom was an iron ring, to which a mask and a neck guard were attached. This type of protection was called a domed helmet. It was expensive, only jarls and kings could afford it. Most warriors went into battle without helmets, covering their heads with wool caps. Archaeologists estimated that for every 100 Viking Age burials found, there was only 1 helmet. This indicates not poverty, but a priority for mobility and speed. According to Anglo-Saxon chronicles, Vikings often landed suddenly, attacking from the sea in a matter of minutes. Their strength lay in maneuver, in the fear they instilled, not in theatrical appearance. And fear does not need horns. It lives in the silence before the strike, in the glint of iron under a gray sky, in the rumble of drums that sounded when the longships touched the shore. Archaeologists note that ceremonial horns did exist, but not on helmets, rather in their hands. A horn, or lure, was used as a musical instrument to summon warriors. Its sound was drawn out, low, almost bestial. Perhaps it was this hum, once heard by Viking enemies before an attack, that gave rise to the legend of horned helmets, a rumor transformed into an image by time. But there is another reason why this myth proved so tenacious. In the 19th century, Europe was experiencing a romantic fascination with barbarians. Artists sought a symbol of savagery, primal strength, and found it in horns. Wagner's theater, the production of The Ring of the Nibelung. It was there that costumer Karl Emil Doppler first added enormous horns to the actors' helmets. They had no connection to archaeology, but they worked perfectly on stage. The audience in the hall felt a primal terror. Thus, the lie became more beautiful than the truth. And yet, when archaeologists in the 20th century unearthed actual Viking burials, the truth surfaced. The real helmets, without ornamentation, without unnecessary shine, covered in rust and sweat. They spoke more than any myth. These helmets did not play a role. They saved lives, and every impact on their metal, every trace of a hammer on the iron, reminded Vikings were not monsters from an opera, but living people. People who knew that true terror was not in horns, but in the eyes of one who walks to death without fear. But to understand what their true combat looked like, one must delve into the very essence of their military art, into that instantaneous storm which ancient chroniclers called the whirlwind of the north. A storm wave breaks against the rocks. Along the coast, the rhythmic thump of oars is heard. Long-bearded warriors row in time with a drum. This is not a horde of savages, as movies often depict. This is a war machine, coordinated and disciplined. Their longships, called drakars, from the word dragon, because the ship's prow was adorned with a carved monster's head, could travel hundreds of kilometers by sea and rivers, under sail or by oar. Each longship accommodated about 60 people. This was not merely transport. It was a weapon of lightning warfare. Before battle, Vikings removed everything superfluous from their heads. Iron was reserved for crucial blows. Simple leather helmets or thick wool caps were in use. Only the wealthiest jarls had iron spangenhelms, often with a mask that covered the face. But not a single source from the 9th through 11th centuries, neither the Jomsviking saga nor the Frankish chronicles, nor the descriptions of the Arab traveler Ibn Fadlan, mentions horns. Not a single one. However, all of them note, Vikings terrified not by their appearance, but by their manner of combat. Before an attack, warriors gathered in a dense formation called swine, or in Old Norse, svinfylking. This was a wedge which crashed into the enemy's ranks with monstrous force. At the forefront went berserkers, those very ones who, according to legends, lost their human form and fought with the madness of a beast. Contemporaries describe them as people who were impossible to stop. They felt no pain, did not retreat even with mortal wounds. At the moment of attack, a battle cry rang out, drawn out like the howl of a wolf, a sound capable of paralyzing the enemy even before the clash. Archaeologists found bones on which traces of scars from sword and axe blows were visible, and nearby, simple iron helmets without ornamentation. These things speak louder than any legends. Their practicality, a manifestation of true northern logic. Live simply, strike accurately, die with honor. When enemies saw how hundreds of longships emerged from the morning mist, they did not need horns to understand who was coming. The Vikings themselves became the embodiment of terror. They were like a storm, impassive, relentless, cold. Their strength was not in costumes, but in discipline and the ability to act without fear. Vikings did not wear horns because they were not needed by those who had already become a symbol of fear. Archaeological finds in Birka, Uppsala, and Trelleborg confirm. Viking armor was minimalistic: mail shirt, axe, shield, sometimes a helmet. The weight of full equipment did not exceed 20 kilograms, which allowed them to move faster than the enemy. Their shields, light, made of linden wood with a diameter of about 80 centimeters. Their swords, short, balanced, often with the inscription Ulfbert, a master's mark, forged from Frankish steel. Frankish chronicles state that when Vikings went into battle, they laughed, as if at death. One scribe recorded, they sang before battle, as if a feast was beginning. This state was called Othrorir, literally, Odin's intoxication. It meant not madness, but a fusion with the spirit of war. For such warriors, horns would not be a symbol of strength, but an interfering burden. Nevertheless, horns were present after all, but in a completely different place. In longhouses where feasts were held after battle. From them, mead and ale were drunk, raising toasts to the fallen. These horns were called mead horns, a horn for mead. It was precisely these that later became a source of confusion for 19th century romantics. A horn from which they drank transformed into a horn that was supposedly worn. All of this speaks to how easily humanity confuses symbol with reality. The horned helmet became an icon because it is convenient for the imagination. But a real Viking, standing on deck in the pouring rain, with a face scorched by the wind, did not need decorations. His eyes were more terrifying than any horns. And yet there is something that makes this legend deeper. For if there were no horned helmets, why did the myth not disappear even after archaeological revelations? Why do thousands of people still see in them a symbol of courage and savagery, although the truth lies in humble iron and cold determination? The answer lies not in history, but in human memory, in how we choose to view the past. Hundreds of years after the last northern kings laid down their arms, the image of the Viking did not die. It changed, becoming a legend, and a legend, as is known, lives longer than truth. When Europe experienced a romantic surge in the 19th century, the attention of historians, artists, and poets turned to the past. The North once again came into vogue. Cold, harsh, barbaric. People of the industrial age yearned for a world of strength and simplicity, where everything was decided by the sword, not by paper. It was then that a new Viking was born. Not one who rode through storms, but one who posed for canvases and sang in operas. During these years, the German composer Richard Wagner was creating his monumental tetralogy, The Ring of the Nibelung. The action in it took place in a mythical North, where humans and gods were intertwined in struggle. But Wagner wrote music while artists created the image of the heroes, and it was the artist Karl Emil Dupler who first placed horned helmets on the heads of actors. He wanted to emphasize the savagery and animalistic power of the heroes. The horns became a theatrical metaphor, a symbol of primal force. No one even imagined that audiences would take this literally. When Wagnerian productions toured Europe, horns became a symbol of the era. Newspapers, posters, illustrations adopted the new style. Thus began the second birth of the Vikings. 19th century artists Otto Zinding, Arbo, Eric Werenskjold depicted them with horns, furs, and enormous axes. And although archaeologists already knew then that this was not true, art proved stronger than science. Romanticism demanded heroes with a legend, not people in mail shirts. The term skald, a poet of ancient Scandinavia, in old sagas meant a guardian of memory. Skalds glorified deeds, not for accuracy, but for inspiration. And in this sense, 19th century artists became the new skalds of Europe. They created not history, but a myth, in which truth dissolved into aesthetics. Against this backdrop, archaeology was only just emerging as a science. The excavations in Gokstad and Osa at the end of the 19th century shocked society. People saw real Viking ships, their armor, and their utensils for the first time. And the more facts scientists uncovered, the more reality diverged from the image. Not a single helmet with horns, only iron, wood, bone. But mass consciousness had already decided, a Viking without horns is not a Viking. This paradox continued into the 20th century. Hollywood, starting with films of the 1950s, solidified the horned style. Cinema did not tolerate boring truth. Audiences wanted recognizability. Thus, actors dressed in furs with heavy helmets stepped from the screen into popular culture. Games, caricatures, sports emblems, all repeated the same mistake. But the paradox is that this image, born of the theater, unwittingly became a reflection of the true spirit of the Vikings. They were indeed wild, but not outwardly, inwardly. Their strength lay in their determination. Modern historians such as Neil Price and Leslie Webster note, the myth of the horns became a symbol of defiance. People see in it not archaeology, but character. Archaeological finds confirm real Viking helmets were adorned not with horns, but with patterns, often depicting animals, wolves, ravens, dragons. These symbols connected man with the world of the gods, especially with Odin, the patron of war and wisdom. The raven was his eye, the wolf his teeth, and the dragon his breath. These signs were not theater, but a prayer engraved on metal. One could say that horns are a metaphor that got out of control. What was meant to denote animalistic strength of spirit became a physical adornment, and this reflects the eternal human tendency to see the external instead of the internal. We believe in horns because they are understandable. They give form to fear, and the fearlessness that hid behind real helmets is too simple. It has no decorations. When 20th century archaeologists began publicly disproving this myth, society no longer wanted to listen. Newspapers wrote, "Scientists are destroying a dream." Thus, truth lost again. But this defeat was not in vain, for behind every myth about Vikings always stood one truth: a person who chooses risk, cold, and storm instead of peace. And therefore, horns are merely a mirror, reflecting the very energy that drove them to sea. And there, in the icy waves, they found not glory, but a test. And everyone who survived understood, true armor is not on the head, but in the heart. The sea hums beneath the keel. Waves crash against the prow of the longship. The air smells of salt and iron. This is a real scene from the lives of those called sea wolves. Vikings embarked on expeditions not for symbols, but for survival. Their lands were harsh, short summers, stony fields, hungry winters. Therefore, they sought their fate at sea, where every storm could be their last. And it was precisely this that made them stronger than any enemy. They did not need horns to inspire fear. Fear emanated from their very determination. Historians note that in the 9th to 11th centuries, Vikings undertook thousands of expeditions from the shores of England to Constantinople. They landed with lightning precision, strike, plunder, retreat. Their strength lay in speed and coordination. A single ship could cover over 100 kilometers in a day if the wind was favorable. But something else was more important. They were masters of deception. Feigned retreats, night raids, sudden river crossings. Their enemies often did not understand whence the blow had struck. Before setting out to sea, special rituals were performed. At sunset, warriors cast a drop of animal blood into the water to appease the spirits of the sea. Then, a bonfire was lit on the shore, where a skald sang of those who had not returned. These songs called not for glory, but for remembrance. Vikings knew every expedition could be their last, and when warriors put on their helmets, even without horns, they still did so as a sacred ritual. Archaeological finds from Birka and Ladoga confirm Viking equipment was characterized by utilitarianism. A mail shirt weighed about 10 kilograms, a sword 1.5, a helmet about 2. A linden wood shield was light, yet strong enough to deflect an axe blow, and the axe, in turn, was their main weapon. Not a knight's sword, but a tool of daily life adapted for combat. Vikings called it breithox, a broad axe. With it, one could both build a house and break down gates. Whoever saw a Viking battle said that they fought not for shouting, but for silence. Their blows were precise, measured, almost cold. No bright clothes, no feathers or horns, only gray iron and a gaze devoid of fear. They did not strive to appear as monsters. They were so in action, not in appearance. Contemporaries wrote that Vikings often fought without helmets at all. Iron was rare, and wearing a helmet was considered a privilege. One who had a helmet became a pillar in battle, the center of the formation. Such fighters were called huskarls, the king's bodyguards. They held the line while others surrounded the enemy. It was their helmets with cruciform overlays that archaeologists later found, and not one of them had horns. One Anglo-Saxon chronicle description states, "They looked like wolves whose eyes gleam in the night." This was an image not of adornment, but of an internal state. Modern historians call this the fear effect, a psychological weapon wielded by the northern warriors. Their strength lay not in appearing frightening, but in being so in essence. In humanity's cultural memory, horns have always symbolized power, strength, and divine fury. But for the Vikings, the symbol of power was not a horned helmet at all, but Thor's hammer, a sign of protection and thunder. This amulet was worn around the neck, not on the head. It meant strength is not in appearance, but in the belief that the thunder god walks alongside. And yet the paradox remained. A millennium later, humanity remembered not these amulets, not real helmets, but fabricated horns. Because horns are easy to draw, but inner determination is not. It is not visible on canvas. It cannot be sold as a souvenir. Therefore, the myth won. But every helmet found by an archaeologist covered in rust is a challenge to the legend. It whispers the truth, softly, like a wave against the shore. We were different. Perhaps this is precisely what makes the history of the Vikings great. They do not need adornments to remain a symbol of bravery. Their real horns are the sound of wind in the sails, the rumble of drums in a storm, the cry of gulls over a charred shore. And in each of these sounds, not a myth, but a living force that neither time nor theater can erase. But before understanding why this myth has not disappeared, even in the 21st century, one must look deeper into human nature, into that very yearning for legend that is stronger than any proof. Why then, despite all the excavations, museum exhibitions, and scientific books, do millions of people still believe that Vikings wore horned helmets? The answer is simple and terrifying. Myth is more convenient than truth. Truth is harsh, cold, without romance, but myth warms, even if it is false. People want to see heroes, not sailors freezing in the rain. They want spectacle, not reality. That is why the horns remained. They outlived an era, burned the truth, and were reborn in culture as a symbol of savagery, strength, and defiance. When 20th century archaeologists, from Norwegian researchers to British specialists in Scandinavia, published new discoveries, it seemed the myth was about to collapse. In museum display cases stood real helmets, dulled, dented, without any ornamentation. Scientists showed photographs, drawings, reconstructions. They wrote, "Not a single horned battle helmet has been found." But the myth continued to live. Why? Because it became a symbol not of the past, but of imagination. For a person needs not only to know, but also to feel. And when a viewer sees a Viking with a horned helmet in a movie, they are not looking for historical accuracy. He seeks energy. These horns became a visual language of strength, the kind that a person would want to possess. We ourselves created this symbol to remember what is almost gone from us, the courage to face the storm. And yet the truth has not disappeared. In the archaeological museums of Oslo, Stockholm, Copenhagen, one can see authentic finds. The helmet from Germanbu, swords with runes, mail shirts, reconstructed longships. On the iron parts, traces of blows, traces of time. They speak without words. Each of these items is a witness to an era where man and metal were one. And when you look at them, you understand. A Viking was not a monster, but a master of survival. His armor, simplicity, his strength, discipline, his pride, resilience. The term by which the Vikings themselves called the ideal warrior sounded like Drenger, a man of honor. A Drenger did not boast, did not adorn himself. He proved everything by his actions. It was this word that conveyed what the legend later distorted. Horns, that is an adornment. Honor, that is a choice. And in this difference lies the whole essence. Vikings did not try to look great, they simply were great. Modern historians call the Viking Age the time of the brave. Their legacy is not in costumes, but in the very idea of venturing into the unknown. They did not know what awaited them beyond the horizon, but they went anyway. And that is why their image is so tenacious. We see in it not barbarians, but the embodiment of human courage. In this lies the secret of the myth's longevity. When Vikings died, their bodies were often burned on a longship, sending them out to sea. The flames reflected on the waves, and it seemed that the sun itself was escorting them to another world. Perhaps it was this image, boat, flame, cold wind, that became the true symbol of the era. Not horns, but fire. Not theater, but silence after the last scream. And yet the legend of the horns proved stronger than facts, because it gives us not knowledge, but a feeling. It reminds us that every person holds within themselves a wildness, one that calls to action, to risk, to overcoming. In this sense, the horns became not a lie, but a metaphor. They grew not from helmets, but from our need to see heroes in ourselves. Today, as archaeologists and historians continue to debate the details, one fact remains unchanged. Vikings were people of flesh and blood. They ate dried fish, slept on furs, froze, lost loved ones, but rose again. They lived without adornments, but with an inner fire. And if anything can be called their true horns, it is their will. And now, knowing the truth, you can ask yourself, what is scarier, a Viking with horns on his helmet, or a person without fear in their eyes? For horns are merely metal, but determination is what does not rust. Therefore, when someone says that Vikings are a myth, remember, they simply did not need theater to become a legend. Their horns rang not on helmets, but in the hearts of those who went to meet the storm.